There are four cybersecurity document types that you should be aware of if you're working in cybersecurity or tech. These documents form a pyramid, and we'll be discussing each of the different document types, what they mean, and when and how to use them. Understanding these is so important, and not just for working within the industry. You often get asked a lot of questions about these in cybersecurity exams. Like when I done the CISSP exam and the CISO exam, this definitely came up, and there was a few questions on these in both exams. And the definition of these document types and categories, if you will, on paper may seem one way, but in reality, they vary from company to company. The lines between them get blurred. When I had less experience and I used to look at company documentation, I always used to think this is wrong, it needs restructuring. However, with more experience, you realize that when security theory meets a real world, as long as the documents are achieving their purpose and their desired outcome, then there's no harm in having it cross over or blur between these categories, and the style, the format, the title, the naming system of the documents don't matter as much as you think. Now, of course, if you're starting from the beginning and writing a document from scratch, it's important to follow and make sure it falls within one of these categories. I'm just saying, in the working world, it's not always as tidy. So we'll start off with number one. Policies. Now, policies are broad statements of management intent. Compliance with policies is mandatory. This is like a law in a lot of ways, a company's law. For example, an information security policy will contain broad statements about cybersecurity objectives, like a statement about the importance of cybersecurity to the organization. Requirements that all staff and contractors take measures to protect the information within their control. And when I say protect, you got to think of it from the CIA triad perspective of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The policy might also contain statements of ownership, responsibility. So information created by the organization falls within the protection of the security team, for example, or the CISO. And you might also have the designation of security roles within the company and a bunch of other things within the document. Now, when you think about it, creating and publishing a policy is a big task. It normally needs approval from the CEO, the CISO, and in big organizations, publishing a policy is a very complex task. Just imagine, the policy might be drafted by their compliance team or their GRC team. It then might go to legal, and then it might go to senior management to approve. And finally, it might even go to the CEO or other really senior stakeholders to give the final approval before it's published. And then depending on the type of environment that the policies are written for, there's so many different regulations and laws that will apply to that organization. So the policy needs to ensure compliance with like so many different requirements. Another thing is they can also vary in length. Now, just because a security policy is longer and bigger, it doesn't necessarily mean that organization is more secure or have more security requirements. It might just be written in a particular way. And some shorter policies reference so many other documents and include so many requirements that aren't necessarily in the policy itself. So yeah, size doesn't always matter. Just for a quick example, the University of Notre Dame or Notre Dame has like a 6-page policy. It's short, it's brief, it's to the point. However, the US Center for Medicare and Medicaid has a 95-page mammoth security policy. And lengthy security policies like this do have a few issues. They quickly become outdated. They constantly need review and updating, and this also increases the chance of them being neglected because you have to update it, reversion it, republish it, all the stakeholders and approvals that may need to take place. It's easier to be short, concise, and broad when it comes to policies. So yeah, just remember, policies are mandatory and you have to abide by them. They're the company's law, and it's not just necessarily applicable to cybersecurity. You also have HR policies and a bunch of other policies that users are subjected to. But anyway, next document type. So number 2, standards. Now, standards provide a set of mandatory requirements that describe how an organization will carry out compliance with policies. Again, they're mandatory, they're not optional typically. However, they don't always apply to everything. For example, a policy might say systems should be securely configured, but that's a vague and broad statement. A standard will come in and actually list or contain the specific configuration settings for that security. So it's like a secure configuration standard. So just to give you an example, when you join an organization and they give you a laptop or a computer or whatever, that is normally based on a secure configuration standard or a baseline. You might hear this referred to as a baseline image or a standard image, meaning the IT team has looked at the operating system, let's say to Windows. They stripped back all the bloatware and all the random rubbish that comes with Windows that you don't need for your job. They might have disabled or enabled specific settings, so they might have turned autoplay off and auto run off. They might have installed specific tooling that they use, like their own antivirus or malware, and maybe specific apps that you need to do your job. So this isn't like a typical Windows install that if you were just to buy a laptop and it comes with all the Windows and stuff. This is a specific build that's based on a standard for that organization. Now, this standard would be documented and maybe even referenced in the policy, and they're normally approved at a lower level of the organization. So you don't need the CEO to approve a standard which literally just adds a new application to the already existing standard or changes a configuration setting. This is normally managed by like the IT team or the security team. And of course, you have standards for so many different things. That's just one example of a secure configuration standard for an operating system, like a baseline or standard image. Now, with standards and policies in general, it's important to take note of exceptions. So for example, everyone in the company might get the same build, but let's say there's a team of developers that need elevated privileges, or a support team that needs to run legacy software to support one of their clients that they're working with, whatever other reason. Now, this deviates from the standard that is documented, so this should be raised as an exception and documented in like an exceptions register. You might have an exceptions process for it to go through before it's approved. But yeah, generally you might have a rule or a law within the company per se, but you also have room for deviations and exceptions to that when it's applicable. And in some organizations, you've got to think there's a very specific industry or regulatory type of standards and best practices that they have to abide by. It may be required by law or contractual reasons, but sometimes standards are just published as helpful resources and best practice. So yeah, that's a quick overview of standards, and we'll get into the next one. Number 3, procedures. Now, procedures are detailed step-by-step processes that individuals and organizations must follow in specific circumstances. So you can think of this like a checklist. A procedure ensures there's a consistent process for achieving an objective, and in our case, a security objective. So they might have standardized procedures for building new systems, releasing code into a live environment, responding to an incident, and many other tasks. You can also think of it from a different perspective, such as like McDonald's will have a specific procedure to cook a certain type of burger. Must cook on this side for 30 seconds and flip it. Then you must use this type of bun with this amount of sauce. It's literally a step-by-step instruction to achieve something. But yeah, enough about burgers. Let's go back to security. So just to give you an example, Visa actually publishes a document called What to Do If Compromised. And this document essentially is a procedure that gives you step-by-step instructions on what to do if there is a compromise. So it'll be like notify Visa within 3 days, provide Visa with an initial investigations report, provide notice to other relevant parties, provide the exposed payment account to Visa, conduct PCI forensic investigation, conduct independent investigation, and preserve evidence. Now, of course, this is aimed at companies, and the document obviously has a lot more detail, but you can see what I mean, how this applies to security, where if something happens or when you want to do something, there's a step-by-step checklist that must be followed, and that is essentially what a procedure is. And it's important to note that there isn't normally much room for interpretation in procedure language. It's very specific, very clear, and again, mandatory to follow when it's relevant and applicable, of course. So when a situation triggers the use of a procedure, or when you need to do something, that needs to follow the procedure. So yeah, on to the next one. Last but not least, number 4, guidelines. Now, guidelines are the only documents that aren't mandatory in this list. They are optional, but you should follow them if you can, type of thing. So they're written in the kind of spirit of providing helpful advice. But that being said, this does vary company to company. Some companies might publish a guideline, but their work culture or the way they run things means that guidelines actually mandatory. But when you think of it from the perspective of answering exams or how it should be done, in theory at least, guidelines are optional, they're not mandatory. You'll often find language like help organizations to decide, provide companies with information to help, provide guidance on whatever. It's this kind of optional, helpful language that is quite common in guidelines. If you think of it from like a system documentation perspective, I think the official term is technical authoring or whatever. If you think of it as the help guide, so if you're using a new piece of software application and there's a help button, the person behind that writing it might have guidelines on the kind of language, the tone the company uses, the structure, how to space things out. However, it might not be mandatory to write it in that way. It's just a guideline designed to help them and is optional. But of course, they might have their own tone or their own way of writing things. And the company's decided that they're not going to make it mandatory for everyone to write things in a particular way. Now, for some organizations, of course, they might have a procedure or a standard or something more mandatory for writing help documentation. But often you'll find that it is generally guidelines that are followed where possible. So it tends to be those kind of nuanced things where you need a bit of guidance, but you can't necessarily document and tell everyone what to do for that specific thing, because it doesn't always work that way. So yeah, I hope this video helps you to understand the differences between documentation you get within tech, cybersecurity, and generally if you work for a company. And don't forget, I have a full Notion page in my description with a ton of resources. I've recently just updated it. Check that out. I am planning to add some projects and a bunch of other resources to it. It's going to be updated and changed over time. Might be worth bookmarking the link or saving it to your own Notion page or whatever. But anyway, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.